My name is Mark Harris. I'm Professor of Natural Science and Theology here at the University of Edinburgh. Let's go straight on to why we're here, which is to listen to Professor John Dupré's Gifford Lecture. It's been an absolute delight to hear him this last week and a half so far on his theme of a process perspective on human life. And tonight we'll hear the fifth of his 6 lectures entitled Human Nature and Humankinds. So I have great pleasure in handing over to Professor Dupré. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. So, human nature and humankinds. Today, I want to consider first the old age question of human nature. Is there even such a thing? In the light of my processual view of life, I shall reject all but the most minimal conceptions of human nature. I then turn to the question of divisions within the human species, sex, race, nation, and more, and ask how we should think about these. Again, a process perspective provides distinctive insight into the questions posed by these controversial categories. With respect to both questions, my main concern will be with understanding human behavior. The human species, I've noted in a previous lecture, is an exceptionally well delineated lineage. We have no close relatives, probably because we wiped them all out, and so there is almost certainly no hybridization between humans and any other species. The set of organisms that are members of the species is entirely determinate. A necessary and sufficient condition for being human is to be part of the lineage, or at least a recent segment of it. This has led some philosophers to a rather simple account of the human essence. It is a historical one, the property of being descended from a particular ancestral population. I have no deep objection to such an historical essence, except for some discomfort with the word essence. Essences serve a range of philosophical functions. One is to distinguish what is and isn't a member of a kind, and the historical essence does serve this task admirably. But a second function is to tell us something about the members of a kind, something reliably true of all of them. And here, the historical essence fails miserably. If, through some bizarre series of mutations, a woman gave birth to a rabbit or an armadillo, that would, in the light of a historical essence, count as human. In principle, the historical essence places no limits at all on the properties that an entity that shares it might have. So such an essence tells us nothing about human nature, the goal that seekers after the human essence are generally concerned with. They have especially been concerned to find the key to a deeper understanding of the ways humans behave. Here, I shall consider only more robust approaches to human nature that might help to provide such understanding. Recent philosophy and science have seen heated debates on this topic. Biological theories of human nature have, unsurprisingly, followed the dominant biological theories of our time. Foremost among these is evolution, and evolutionary theories of human nature, first sociobiology, and then, with a slight rebrand, evolutionary psychology, have been much promoted and debated. Perhaps equally prestigious in more recent biology has been genetics, and sure enough, there has been considerable effort in seeking genetic understandings of behavior. Since dominant theories of evolution have stressed changes to genes as underpinning evolutionary change, these approaches have generally been taken to be readily compatible. Social science and philosophers in particular have generally been hostile to both evolutionary and genetic explanations of behavior. At the root of this hostility is the view that humans are far more subtly and complexly responsive to their environments than such explanations can allow. Defenders of the biological perspective, most notably Steven Pinker, have responded by accusing their opponents of treating the human mind as a blank slate on which society can write anything it chooses. There is, however, a curious kind of semi-truce in this debate. Both sides agree that what we need is a so-called interactionism, which recognizes human behavior as resulting from a mixture of biological and environmental, especially social or cultural, factors. But the truth is somewhat illusory, for both sides tend to claim that interactionism is exactly what they've always proposed. It is their benighted opponents who insist on their biological determinism or their blank slates. The problem then seems to be how to articulate plausible interactionism. The most prominent biological theory of human nature at present is evolutionary psychology, especially as propounded by anthropologist and psychologist John Dupré and Leda Cosmides, sometimes known as the Santa Barbara School, after the university at which both work. This is not, of course, merely the banal thesis that we evolved, and so, therefore, did our psychology. It is a specific account of how our evolution determined our psychology. The basic thesis of evolutionary psychology is that we evolved a set of mental modules to adapt to life in the Stone Age, and these ultimately drive our current behavior. Recurrent problems faced our distant ancestors concerning such things as access to food or sexual partners or negotiations with other humans, and psychological mechanisms evolved to generate optimal responses to these problems. The Stone Age, or more precisely the Pleistocene, covers the last 2.5 million years, excepting the last 12,000, generally referred to as the Holocene. Its relevance is that it covers a long period of distinctively human evolution after our split from our cousins, the apes. It is also controversially suggested that the human environment during this period was relatively stable, allowing for sustained evolution or selection of optimal traits. Modern human behavior has only existed for a very short time and not long enough, evolutionary psychologists claim, for significant evolutionary change to have occurred. Numerous objections have been raised to the evolutionary psychology picture, many focused on underlying disagreements about the nature of the evolutionary process. The atavism of evolutionary psychology, the idea that the roots of human behavior were shaped in a distant past age, depends on the idea that evolution is wholly genetic, and the accumulation of the genes supposedly sufficient to shape behavior would take thousands of generations. But more expansive views of evolution include other forms of inheritance, such as cultural or epigenetic, and taking account also of the changes to the environment produced by the evolving population, niche construction. These can promote far more rapid changes. If these processes are recognized, the underlying causes of human behavior can be seen to have a much more recent origin, to be more specifically adapted to the present, and, crucially, may vary in major ways from time to time and place to place. It is the actual observation of such historical and cross-cultural variation by historians and social scientists that has done a great deal to drive such arguments. In endorsing these objections, which I do, am I endorsing a blank slate view? Not at all. Very few thinkers, I suggest, have ever really believed any such thing. To mention a few objections, humans strongly resist some forms of enculturation, for example, enslavement. No one seriously doubts that humans are highly social, typically enjoy status, food, and sex, and so on. And there are surely psychological constraints on what kind of social organization is even possible. Given that evolutionary psychologists generally propose that what evolved was psychological mechanisms or modules that drive behavior only in response to the observed environmental conditions, is there perhaps a convergence on a viable interactionism? Perhaps some, but not all that much, I fear. The difference, I think, is that while not quite a blank slate, the critics of evolutionary psychology do generally believe that a distinctive feature of humans is the flexibility and adaptability of their behavior, not unlimited flexibility, but a lot more than evolutionary psychologists generally allow. In a previous lecture, I mentioned how this made possible the unique division of labor in human societies, that different members of a society develop very different suites of skills. These are surely grounded in a physical structure, principally the brain, but probably not in modules dedicated to specific aspects of Pleistocene life in the ways evolutionary psychology has assumed. One reason to believe in this flexibility is that, as I mentioned, it is probably quite false that the Pleistocene was a constant environment. What made humans so successful was not their close fit to these putatively stable conditions, but their adaptability to different conditions, perhaps especially those that came about at the beginning of the Holocene and end of the Pleistocene, the end of the last ice age 12,000 years ago. This growing adaptability is a far more plausible explanation of the extraordinary successes of the human species than is the evolution of a set of more or less stereotyped responses to the supposedly fixed conditions of Stone Age life. Strongly concordant with the preceding point is my continuing argument that we should see humans as open-ended developmental processes. Plasticity, I have previously observed, is a common feature of the great majority, at least, of multicellular organisms. For an organism for which complex behavior is as central to its way of life as it is for humans, it would be remarkable if behavior were not a flexible outcome of the very long developmental process that humans exhibit. Contra the blank slate, plasticity is not unlimited. Contra the evolutionary psychologists, we have very little idea of the limits of human developmental plasticity. Pragmatically, given this situation, we should remain agnostic about these limits and explore ways of extending them. This does not, again, require a commitment to the blank slate. Human plasticity is especially important in moderating our tendency to ascribe difference in human development to differences in innate ability. This point about human plasticity has been beautifully described by a historical figure who will be surprising to some in this context, Adam Smith. Smith wrote, "The difference of natural talents in different men is, in reality, much less than we are aware of, and the very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions, when grown up to maturity, is not, upon many occasions, so much the cause as the effect of the division of labor. The difference between the most dissimilar characters, between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature as from habit, custom, and education. When they came into the world, and for the first 6 or 8 years of their existence, they were perhaps very much alike, and neither their parents nor playfellows could perceive any remarkable difference. About that age, or soon after, they come to be employed in very different occupations. The difference of talents comes then to be taken notice of and widens by degrees till at last the vanity of the philosopher is willing to acknowledge scarce any resemblance. I think this is just right. To summarize then the conclusions about human nature, the reason this is a generally unhelpful concept is that both the human lineage and human individuals are highly plastic, adaptable processes. We can, of course, make statistical, empirical investigations about what humans are like at this time and in a particular place, and there are often good reasons to do so. The wider we spread our net over human populations, however, the more variance we are likely to find in our investigations. And the further we project these generalizations into the future, the less reliable they are likely to be. For the remainder of this lecture, I shall explore human variability a bit further by looking at some of the finer structure of the process that is the human species. Humans are extremely diverse in their habits, behavior, and lifestyles. Being humans ourselves, this diversity tends to be of considerable interest to us and leads us to multiple ways of dividing ourselves into kinds: age, weight, occupation, social class, race, gender, and so on. However, we should generally be suspicious of strong claims about the implications of belonging to such human kinds. One pervasive reason for this is that the features that form the basis of these classifications generally have multiple causes, and members of the classes distinguished may therefore differ in multiple other respects. A more subtle point that has been persuasively developed by the philosopher Ian Hacking is that much of the homogeneity within humankinds is actually a consequence rather than a cause of the classification. In these cases, which Hacking referred to as looping kinds, characteristic behavior is largely a consequence of the distinguishing of the kind. A classical example of this phenomenon is the emergence of homosexuals as a kind of person rather than as a kind of behavior more or less favored by some people that has been proposed and documented by Michel Foucault. Gay culture, gay affect, and other characteristics that enable some to immediately identify some gay people are not natural concomitants of being gay, pleiotropic consequences of imagined gay genes, but a suite of behavior that emerged as people responded to being classified as a distinct kind. So let me then start with the distinction or family of distinctions among people that has the strongest ties to biology, that between the sexes or genders. It may help to begin with some elementary biology. Biological sex is understood by biologists as a mating system, which, as I discussed in an earlier lecture, is also evolutionarily significant for its role in creating integrated, stable lineages. It consists of a division into two mating types, each providing one gamete, that is, sperm or egg, the two together forming the zygote that launches the life cycle of a new organism. The gametes are usually of very different sizes, and the sex that provides the larger gamete is usually called female. That which provides the smaller gamete is called male. In the human case, the female, in addition to providing the larger gamete, the egg, carries the physiological adaptations for gestation, birth, and lactation. The genetic difference that correlates with physiological sex differences in humans is the possession of XX, that is female, or XY, male, chromosomes, in addition to the 22 pairs of so-called autosomal chromosomes. This genetic difference does not apply generally. Birds have a quite different genetic differentiation. Many reptiles develop into one sex or the other, depending on ambient temperature. And some fish change sex as they reach a certain size. The phenomenon of sex difference, gamete size differentiation, must not be confused with any of its various correlates. And finally, there are duplications and deletions in the sex chromosomes, so not everyone is XX or XY, and not everyone with XX or XY chromosomes follows the sex-typical developmental path. Nothing in biology is simple. So far, the basic biology. This is not very far at all in discussing the natures of the kinds that sexual difference defines for humans. This is fairly obvious based simply on observation of the huge historical and cross-cultural differences in behavioral norms for the sexes. Just compare the anthropological record on polygamy, polyandry, and monogamy, only the most basic distinctions among marriage kinds. Much better to start with something like sex-gender, sex/gender that is, as the feminist biologist Anne Fausto Sterling has named it. Sex/gender is a roughly bifurcating developmental process that leads from the sex assignment at birth, usually but not invariably aligning with the XX or XY genotype, to gendered adults. The gender-differentiated characteristics of mature adults in most or all societies are highly normative, and many aspects of the developmental infrastructure are explicitly directed to achieving this outcome. Many factors, genes, hormones, brains, parenting, schools, social networks, and so on, contribute to stabilizing this process. Nonetheless, there is variation all along the trajectory, and there is a diverse set of possible outcomes. A central aspect of this diversity is acknowledged and given some degree of normative resistance to the dominant narrative, with the acronym GTPQ+, or its variants. How should we understand the diverse outcomes of this gendering process? It will be obvious that I can only scratch the surface of this question here. The central point relative to my current project is to stress first that sex gender is a developmental process. Substance thinking divides the world into kinds of things with characteristic properties. In this view, a zygote is a thing of one of two kinds, male and female, and it has a set of mechanisms that normally guide the unfolding of a certain kind of adult through the genetic program. Substantially different outcomes are generally considered pathological, as has indeed often been the case for the medical history of gender diversity. Alternatively, putting even more weight on the normativity, they are considered moral failures. Until quite recently, it was standard to think of sex as the fixed starting point and gender as the culturally variable and contestable developmental outcome. This is a framework that has led to a great deal of insight from the work of feminist scholars over the last 50 years and more. In particular, it has increasingly undermined the picture of gender as a natural unfolding, as it has both revealed the empirical diversity of normative gender systems and disclosed the processes by which particular normative systems are implemented. Just as one example drawn almost at random from thousands, here are two of the photographs taken by the Korean artist Jeongmi Yoon of children with their clothes, toys, and other belongings. A number of very similar photographs hammer home this point. One might, I suppose, imagine that it was a natural feature of people with a double X chromosome that they have a liking for the color pink. This seems unlikely, given that pink has been a color associated with masculinity until quite recently. Yoon quotes an American newspaper, the Sunday Sentinel, advising mothers in 1914 to, quote, use pink for the boy and blue for the girl if you are a follower of convention. According to Wikipedia, the first inauguration of Dwight D. Eisenhower, when Eisenhower's wife, Mamie Eisenhower, wore a pink dress as her inaugural gown, is thought to have been a key turning point in the association of pink as a color associated with girls. Subsequently, however, the current norms have come to many to seem just natural and have not entirely gone away. There is, of course, scientific evidence offered in favor of the more traditional view of gender as the unwinding of a program inscribed in the sex chromosomes. In an article in The Guardian entitled Male and Female Brains Wired Differently, Scans Reveal, readers were treated to pictures of brightly colored brains highlighting the distinctive pathways in brains belonging to male and female subjects. According to the article, Rajini Verma, a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, said the greatest surprise was how much the findings supported old stereotypes, with men's brains apparently wired more for perception and coordinated actions, and women's for social skills and memory, making them better equipped for multitasking. The only comment required on this, as on a great deal of the research in the area, is why assume the wiring of the brain is a cause rather than an effect of gender difference? Recall here Ian Hacking's looping kinds. Avoidance of the confusion of causation and correlation is, of course, the first methodological rule taught to every neophyte scientist. The point I want to make with the last example is not to ridicule the work of a respected group of scientists, but to note how powerful an unquestioned framework can be in shaping a research project and interpreting its results. Thinking in terms of the mechanistic unfolding of a genetic program, gene sequences, causes brain structure, causes behavior, it is natural to assume that brain structure is caused by sex-specific genes and in turn causes the stereotypical gendered behavior of men and women. But thinking in terms of a developmental process driven by multiple factors, then it is the surprise that brain supported old stereotypes that is bizarre, Of course people are trained to conform to normative stereotypes, and of course their brains come to manifest structures that serve this conformity. Sex gender, then, is properly seen as what I've called a homeoretic process, a process stabilized often by a wide range of factors to follow a particular path. This is a good point to recall Waddington's iconic representation of a homeoretic process, this time including the part that I suppressed in the last lecture. The widest canyon leads to the, quote, normal, i.e. most typical, outcome, but changes to the stabilizing conditions, and now see the pegs under the landscape, may change the topology so as to divert the ball down a side canyon. The idea is you can disconnect some of the pegs and the topology changes. Or, in fact, merely stochastic movements, from the point of view of the model, of the ball itself may result in diversion down a different pathway. The stabilizing factors, as just mentioned, include such things as hormones, parenting, schooling, social environment, and so on, as well, no doubt, as genes, and these all may change the shape of the landscape. Recall also that there are different starting points, including genotypes different from XX and XY, such as X0, XXY, XYY. One might think of these, and probably many other genes on autosomes, that's non-sex chromosomes, as imparting a different spin or velocity to the starting ball, thereby changing the probability of diversion onto a canyon other than the main one. So, what does all this tell us about the empirical work on sex gender, ranging from the kind of neuroscience just mentioned to the vast quantities of empirical investigation, often by evolutionary psychologists, of such questions as what body shapes people find attractive and whether they are willing to have a date with an attractive stranger who propositions them on the street. Spoiler, men often will, women never. The first thing to say about all such research is that it provides a snapshot of a process, not an insight into the essence of a thing. Such research, generally carried out on American college students, describes a particular stage in the development of this human cohort. From this point of view, the fact that women who've grown up in a society in which sexual violence is an everyday fact of life are unwilling to have a potentially intimate relation with an unknown man is hardly surprising. If anyone wants to object that violence against women is just another fixed outcome of the genetic program in men, they should look at the variability of relevant crime statistics. Although it's difficult to get fully accurate statistics on such matters, the variability is hard to dispute. The USA, for example, is reported to have 27 times the per capita incidence of rape in Japan, and these are not even the extreme outliers. Tempting though it is to dodge this heated and difficult issue entirely, I should probably say something about the implications of all this for understanding transgender. The first and simplest thing to say is that this is clearly one outcome of the development of sex/gender, one canyon in the Waddington diagram. Second, given this, if this is in doubt, no one should be condemned or mistreated for ending up with this outcome. Whether this pathway is encoded in the genes or develops in childhood, for most transgender people, their condition is clearly no more experienced as an optional choice than is homosexuality. Surely everyone should have the right to decide how they dress, what name they prefer, or the pronouns with which they would like to be identified. I shall not hope to offer a solution to the most fraught questions of all concerning who should be allowed in which toilets, gyms, dressing rooms, or prisons. I note only that the developmental processes I am discussing are not simple, and the outcomes do not fall into homogeneous kinds. In deciding who should be allowed to use, for instance, women's shelters, the answer must surely lie somewhere between, on the one hand, anyone who says they are a woman, and on the other, only people who were identified as female at birth. Where on the spectrum the line should be drawn could at least be acknowledged to be a matter about which well-meaning people may disagree and enter into serious discussion. Finally, there is a question of language. Woke-baiting politicians like to ask whether trans women are women or define women as menstruators, possessors of wombs, etc. It is, I think, unhelpful to deny that there is a biological frame within which woman has been used to mean female human, and female to refer to a member of the sex that produces larger gametes. Why this should be the only acceptable usage in a population in which most people have never heard of a gamete and still less of the significance of relative gamete size is quite another matter. Gender and identity are typically more salient aspects of a person's life than the biological details of reproduction. The terms sex and gender were introduced by second-wave feminists to insist that the social and behavioral differentiation of men and women, gender, was grounded in society, not biology, sex. For several reasons, including the question of transgender, the distinction eventually proved simplistic. The usage sex/gender is intended to point to the difficulty of disentangling these two concepts. Not all women, even defined in terms of gamete size or chromosome type, menstruate or have uteruses. One obvious thing to say is that there are many kinds of women, of which trans women are one or many. But surely this doesn't mean we always need to qualify the use of the word woman by parenthetically adding the kind to which a particular woman belongs. This would be much like supposing we always needed to mention someone's race when referring to them. Most of the time, this would be irrelevant and offensive. So, let me now turn to the other, most widely discussed, systematic variation between humans, that which is referred to by race. In the 19th century, there was a heated debate over whether distinct human races, subspecies, or even species had evolved independently on the different continents, or whether they were variations within a single species. The latter argument was decisively successful, and now even the most unhinged racists are unlikely to claim that different human races are distinct species. Debate, however, over how exactly races should be understood remains alive and well, however. Partly, this reflects a good deal of more general uncertainty about subspecific divisions. The only formally acknowledged taxonomic rank below the species for animals, plants and fungi are more complicated, is the subspecies, though even this is not very clearly defined. Some degree of physiological and genetic distinction and some kind of isolation, usually geographical, but perhaps merely behavioral, is required to qualify as a subspecies, as subspecies are by definition members of the same species and could therefore interbreed if there were no barriers to their doing so. The human species is generally acknowledged to be too young and mobile to evolved subspecies. Too young because populations need to be isolated for a considerable time to evolve the sort of differences that might qualify for subspecific distinction, and too mobile because human migration has quite quickly broken down temporary isolation. The scientific consensus is that Homo sapiens is a very widespread but rather genetically homogeneous species with some local variation, largely reflecting adaptation to local climate. Physical anthropologist Nina Jablonski provides compelling evidence that skin color, in particular, is a highly plastic, i.e. rapidly evolving, adaptation to balance vitamin D production and ultraviolet light damage in different regimes of solar irradiation. Whatever the scientific consensus, many or most people take the evidence of their eyes to show that there are distinct races of people, and they believe that they can readily tell to what race a person belongs, at least in most instances. For a long time, the scientifically informed public were, nonetheless, willing to accept what the scientists told them. This was no doubt in part because the grim history of racial discrimination made the non-existence of race an attractive finding, but also because advocates of this view had persuasive and understandable ways of making their point. In particular, research by the distinguished population geneticist geneticist Richard Lewontin in the 1970s showed that for any two humans, the genetic differences attributable to race were very small compared to the typical differences between people of the same race. Thus, any given individual could have more genetic similarities to a person of a different race than to one of their own race. As Lewontin wrote, based on randomly chosen genetic differences, human races and populations are remarkably similar to each other, with the largest part by far of human variation being accounted for by the differences between individuals. He concluded that human racial classification is of no social value and is positively destructive of social and human relations. The argument has itself been widely debated, but on the whole it has reinforced the consensus. Human race is biologically unimportant and largely a social construct. Indeed, echoing the critique of race science as a justification of colonialism, it was increasingly argued that race was a consequence of racism rather than racism a response to race. However, the rise of genomic science has led some to think that the scientific status of racial categories needs to be rethought. Here is a quote from the sometimes controversial but well-known science journalist Nicholas Wade. Analysis of genomes from around the world, he writes, establish that there is a biological basis for race, despite the official statements to the contrary of leading social science organizations. An illustration of the point is the fact that with mixed race populations, such as African Americans, geneticists can now track along an individual's genome and assign each segment to an African or European ancestor, an exercise that would be impossible if race did not have some basis in biological reality. The basis of this claim is a widely cited and discussed 2002 paper in the journal Science by Noah Rosenberg and colleagues, Genetic Structure of Human Populations. Rosenberg et al. Studied several hundred genetic loci from over 1,000 individuals belonging to 52 populations. The loci they used were microsatellites, repetitive elements of the genome generally thought to be non-functional and therefore subject to high rates of mutation and minimal selection. Their research, in fact, confirmed Lewontin's much earlier finding that at most 5% of the overall variation was between major groups as opposed to between individuals within groups. Nonetheless, they also were able to use these genetic data to sort individuals with a high degree of accuracy into groups that corresponded well with geographic regions and familiar racial categories. This is the basis of Wade's claim. But what does this research really show? A crucial point to note concerns the program called Structure that was used to analyze these genetic data. Using Structure, it is necessary first to specify the number of groups, K, into which the data are to be sorted. Having done this, the program selects the best clustering of the data into this number of groups. Starting with K equals 2, the structure identifies groups anchored by Africa and America. Each unitary increasing K divides one of these groups, and by K equals 5, it divides the data into familiar major geographic regions of origin: African, Asian, European, Native American, and Oceanian. K equals 6, however, splits off the isolated Kailash group in northwest Pakistan, a unique and persecuted group with a religion related to Hinduism and a population of about 4,000. As is well understood, small isolated groups may be subject to rapid genetic drift, so it is no surprise that such groups begin to appear as K is increased. So what are we really seeing here? The human lineage is a process, let us recall, and for the last 100,000 years, it has been an extremely dynamic one, migrating from East Africa across the globe and incidentally wiping out all other species of humans along the way, whether by violence, competition, or just absorption. If we think of the migration pattern as a tree, then, very roughly, bearing in mind cases such as the Kailash, the further from a common ancestor in the tree, the greater the genetic diversity through drift. So structure is, more or less, mapping the migrational history of Homo sapiens. Recall that we've been considering a genetic measure of difference that is explicitly chosen to exclude or minimize selective evolution. No doubt, also, these populations have been subject to some selective evolution in terms of superficial phenotypic differences, as well as experiencing some genetic drift. Thus, we can observe phenotypic differences that give us a fairly reliable basis for inferring ancestral history. As I mentioned, skin color is a trait particularly susceptible to rapid, locally adaptive evolution. But this tree generated by structure does not give us an evolutionary history marking lineage divides. We are looking at processes within the lineage, and we are tracking dominant movements, not unidirectional movements. We should not imagine a committee 50,000 years ago deciding that it was time for everyone to move to China. Some people are moving against these dominant flows, and if there is selection for traits that are not merely of local value, they are likely to spread into other branches of the tree. The genetic information, in short, is not about different kinds of people. It is about the ancestries of people in terms of flows within the wider human lineage. And contrary to the idea that showing different racial or ancestral groups have detectable genetic differences supports the hypothesis of racial difference, the genes in question are, again, chosen precisely for their lack of phenotypic or physiological significance. The notion that they provide support for the expectation of systematic differences in behavior or behavioral capacity is not only lacking in any biological rationale, but it also carries the serious risk of occluding the differences in social and economic background, opportunity, and experience that surely do cause difference in the traits of people whose lives are shaped by racial classification. This is where such research, unless very carefully interpreted, can be seriously harmful. To conclude this part of the talk, biological race in humans does not mark a phenomenon of any biological importance. It is rather the reified legacy of a historical process, the migratory history of our species. In fact, the research by Rosenberg et al. Shows the very opposite of what Wade suggests, and in fact, a claim very similar to Lewontin's is stated in the Rosenberg paper and indeed at one point in Wade's article. We should not think of biological races as defining different kinds of people. Rather, they are the genetic and phenotypic souvenirs that individual humans or groups of humans have acquired on their particular path through the complex process that is the recent human lineage. Race is biologically trivial, but remains detectable both genetically and phenotypically. Why? The human lineage contains a huge mélange of migrations, large and small, but most of these are lost in the melting pot of human reproduction. At least one of my ancestors on both sides of my family, I believe, was a Huguenot, part of a major migration from France to various parts of Europe in the late 17th century, and one of them bequeathed me my last name. Subsequent migrations established Huguenot settlements in North America, South Africa, and Australia. No doubt they took some genetic markers with them, and there was a chance that I carry still some of these markers. And certainly, there were skills and practices that were dispersed with the people, some of which survive today. But recalling two of my central theses, that a process requires active stabilization and a lineage is a process, apart from a few isolated societies and churches in the USA, there are no institutions that maintain the Huguenot cultural lineage. Most descendants of Huguenots, like me, maintain this heritage as no more than a historical curiosity. Why are races so much more persistent? Precisely because they are sustained by robust cultural processes. This is the deep truth, I suggest, to the immediately paradoxical claim that racism causes race rather than race causing racism. The normal fate of a migration within the geographic range of a species, human or otherwise, is dispersal among the current inhabitants. What prevents this is creation of barriers to intermingling and especially to interbreeding. In the human case, this is most commonly achieved by the stigmatization of immigrants as belonging to inferior races or inferior cultures. We should, I believe, hope for the end of race as anything more than the historical curiosity that I might claim for my trace of Huguenot ancestry. This is not, of course, to deny that there are pressing questions of justice to be addressed before it will even be morally desirable to forget the concept of race. But I do insist, following Lewontin, that our goal should be the end of any racial classifications. There may be a concern that the end of race would entail a loss of cultural diversity. The simple response is that there are surely no race-specific cultures. Even if we exclude such phenotypically black people as native Australians and limit the word black to people with African ancestors from sub-Saharan Africa within the last few centuries, there is no reason to expect a common culture. It is revealing that the idea of a white culture suggests only racist ideology. The kinds of cultures we might want to preserve are much narrower, at least as narrow as Bantu or African American, Basque or Italian. Would the end of racial distinctions in the US mean the end of jazz, for instance? Obviously not. Though jazz has origins in Africa and then in black populations in America, there are now plenty of white or Asian jazz musicians. Cultural traditions are maintained by many practices apart from racial distinction, in this case by the training and performance of a large community of musicians. Let me conclude with some brief reflections on cultural lineages. There is no doubt that all humans have a place in both the human biological lineage, with its many flows of people and their biological idiosyncrasies, and many cultural lineages. Cultural lineages include skills, sports, art forms, nationalities, religions, languages, and much more. All of these are processes, sustained, if they are sustained, by the practices of their members and adherents. Some, like membership of large nation-states, can function rather like races. They are more or less pure vehicles of distinction, maintained not by the distinctive characteristics of their practitioners, but by the institutional imposition of borders, passports, voting rights, and such like. These are reified into different kinds of things for various, usually questionable purposes by enthusiastic nationalists. While there are many things I admire that are more or less strongly associated with Britain or with England, the nationalities I still carry since my European identity has been taken from me, I don't think they depend on these institutions. Pubs, British universities, cricket, socialised medicine, free at the point of delivery, the BBC, the Notting Hill Carnival, Burns Night, Christmas dinner, Scotch whisky, and on, are not dependent on the maintenance of borders. On the contrary, openness to the cultural traditions from around the world and the people who bring them has constantly enriched the lives of British people. Indian and Chinese food among countless world cuisines, rock music and grand opera, world literatures, this list is even longer than the last. The richest of the human process, at its best, is its ability to differentiate into communities that generate new possibilities for human life and practice, and often to disperse these around the species. On the whole, these are maintained not negatively, as is the case for biological lineages such as race that persist only by deliberate isolation from the surrounding genetic flow, but positively by the enactment of the practices that constitute them. It may be necessary to protect some of the smaller cultural flows, languages, religions, and traditions of small communities with more boundary-like measures to prevent their diffusion into the dominant culture, but this is the preserving of diversity as a resource rather than its exclusion as a threat. Some kind of isolation is needed for cultural preservation and cultural evolution, but usually this is sufficiently provided by the discipline and dedication of of adherents or practitioners. A great deal of human diversity and much that is to be treasured can be understood in terms of the location of the individual in these various cultural lineages. But, finally, the human species has reached a point where a further perspective is essential, one that cuts across all these local cultures, to the trajectory of the species as a whole and the niche, more or less the world, that it inhabits. We are a species currently in a process of deconstructing its niche. Our eating practices, our individualized and carbon-intensive modes of travel, our general overconsumption, our ideological commitment to economic growth, and more, are changing the entire planet in ways that threaten its ability to support our own lives. The solution to this problem, and no doubt many others, is increasingly hampered by competitive ideologies at both the individual and national level, and the boundaries that continue to frame these competitive principles. We need to instill in people the sense of being human, part of the human species, and not just being an instance of the human kind, but as being part of the process, which is the human species. We might learn something here from Native American thought. The seventh generation principle is based on an ancient Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, philosophy that the decisions we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. This is reflected in a powerful statement by Rick Hill Sr., a citizen of the Beaver clan of the Tuscarora Nation of the Haudenosaunee at Grand River, painter, carver, photographer, basket weaver, and consultant to National Museum of the American Indian, Smithsonian Institution. He says, "If you ask me what is the most important thing that I have learned about being a Haudenosaunee, it is the idea that we are connected to a community, but a community that transcends time. We're connected to the first Indians who walked on this earth, the very first ones, however long ago that was. But we're also connected to those Indians who aren't even born yet, who are going to walk this earth. And our job in the middle is to bridge that gap. You take the inheritance from the past, you add to it your ideas and your thinking, and you bundle it up and shoot it to the future. You come here to work hard so that the future can enjoy that benefit." Here I see ethical thinking grounded in the assumption that we are part of a process of which we are merely a transient part. Could we even imagine extending such thinking to an awareness of being part of a species, or even perhaps of a vastly larger process still of life on Earth? Again, this is not a thought that should be grounded in membership of a kind, sharing of an essence, but in being part of a process. It seems increasingly clear, as the degradation of our planet and the drastic changes to our climate resulting from human activity increase by the day, that unless we can achieve and take seriously such a perspective, the future of the human species and much else of life on our planet is in grave peril. Failure to fit one's own interests to the limits imposed by the importance of the health of this larger process is almost literally cancerous. This way of thinking may sound an ambitious and unlikely achievement, but perhaps it is the only way that human civilization, and perhaps even human life, can be sustained for much longer. In my final lecture, I shall return to the individual and the ancient question of freedom of the will. But for today, it remains only to thank you for your attention and invite your questions.